From one of Australia's former leading homicide detectives, this is icatchkillers with Gary Jubelin.
I was so green, I didn't realise that when the head of major crime calls you, it's pretty serious.
Yeah.
He said he was in a little place called Snowtown and he described the barrels, and they said, "Do you want to come up?" And I said, "No, the evidence is in there, why don't you just bring them down to Adelaide?" So I didn't go to the crime scene because for me the crime scene was actually within the barrels. We'd been told they were full of acid, so it could be toxic, so we had to test the fluid. Then we had to work out how to empty the barrels and not lose evidence. So there were 8 bodies partially dismembered in the barrels. Well, I tried to convince Paul Schramm that it was probably hydroponic, and he said, "What should he do?" And I said, "Well, take the lid off, and if you find remains, give me a call." And 10 minutes later he said, "Yes, there are feet poking out."
I Catch Killers with Gary Jubelin.
Today's guest, Professor Roger Byard, is a forensic pathologist. One of the many cases he was involved in was examining the remains of 11 murdered victims, 8 of which were stored in barrels in the South Australian Snowtown murders case. He has seen more death than anyone should, but still manages to have what I found to be a practical and compassionate view about life and death. He has conducted thousands of post-mortem examinations, examining the remains of people who have died of unnatural causes, been murdered, victims of terrorist attacks, natural disasters, or even killed by animals. We spoke about his career spanning more than 40 years, including some of the truly bizarre cases that he has seen and the work that he does to prevent death. Roger discussed his career and the personal impact it had on him in an open and honest way. And I think you're going to find this chat fascinating. It's probably appropriate to give a content warning up front. What we talk about here is quite confronting. Roger, from a homicide detective's point of view, the role of a forensic pathologist is critical to a murder investigation. When we've been called out for a body that's been found in suspicious circumstances, the first thing I know from my point of view and other detectives, we want the opinion of a forensic pathologist. What's the role of forensic pathologist and why is it so important in an investigation?
Well, Gary, as you know, it's variable. Sometimes it's really critical, other times it's not. Yeah. I mean, if somebody is shot in the head in front of 30 witnesses, you don't need a forensic pathologist to tell you what's happened. But other times we act as a team, so we're working together. So the police have worked the scene and we have a body and they want to know what's a likely cause of death. What do I think has happened? What are non-possibilities? So it guides them. So they're looking for a samurai sword, not a pistol, sort of thing. Time of death is always a very difficult issue, and we're often called in the past for that. But that's become. I think we've become more aware that it's not as accurate as we used to think it was. Yeah. We had those incredibly interesting scientific charts and you'd plot this and that and they died at 2 minutes past midnight and, as I say, plus or minus a week.
But from a detective's point of view, crucial to an investigation if you can get the time of death or when the incident occurred.
Yeah, I mean, if they're warm, the body temperature is about 37 degrees. That means it's happened very recently, which means that the perpetrator may be in the area. Yeah. If you can give them a time frame, then it cuts down on the number of people that may be involved. And I think that's the importance of it. As well, the police come to the autopsy as well so that we can chat about stuff and work our way through. People have said we should record all of our conversations. Well, I disagree with that because it's a work in progress. We're coming up with all sorts of theories and we're bouncing it off each other and using each other's experience to say, no, I don't think that's likely, or yes, I think that's possible.
Yeah, and it's appropriate from a policing point of view. If we've got, this person was last sighted, we know for a fact that this person was at the shopping centre at 9 a.m. in the morning. That type of information could be helpful for you. Yes,
indeed. But strange things happen. I remember I went to a stabbing and this fellow had been stabbed multiple times, but he had drops of blood on his back. So I was very excited by this in the mortuary. I said, the only way he could get that is if it had dropped from a height. It must be the perpetrator's blood. So I worked it up for about 45 minutes, and then one of the crime scene cops came in and said, I actually passed the bloody T-shirt over the back of the body. So, but the usefulness of that is getting information from each other so we don't make mistakes.
Yeah. What's the, have you got any case, well, you've done over 6,000 post-mortem, so when I say have you got any cases, I assume that there's a lot in that memory of yours. Ones that your initial thoughts on it changed to be completely different to what the final analysis was?
Well, I think probably one of the most recent ones was Jasmine Kaur, a young Punjabi woman who was buried alive by her ex-boyfriend. He had a story that they had a suicide pact and she had cuts on the side of her neck. So the initial assumption was that he'd cut her neck and then buried the body. But the cuts were very superficial. And so the assessment at the crime scene was inaccurate. It wasn't cuts. She'd actually inhaled soil. She'd been buried alive, and so that was completely different from what we originally thought, and horrific, of course.
Yeah, I want to talk further about that case because that is quite horrific. And in your role as a forensic pathologist, did you go out to the crime scenes, or it was on a need basis when you attended crime scenes?
You do and you don't.
Yeah.
For example, Snowtown, which we're going to talk about, I didn't go to the crime scene there because that was a bank vault. For me, the crime scene was in the barrels.
Yeah.
And so we'll talk about that, how the evidence was inside the barrels. So we brought those down to Adelaide. With Jasmine, I went to the crime scene and assisted with the exhumation, just to see the process, also to be able to tell the court, yes, I was there, I saw these injuries or not. Because if you're not at the crime scene, sometimes it can be put to you, well, clearly these injuries occurred post-mortem when the body was being moved. Yeah. But if I could say, no, I was there and this is what I saw, and I document what I saw.
Yeah. And crime scenes can be misleading. I recall one where I turned up at a crime scene, called out to it on a Friday afternoon. I go into the crime scene, there's a person naked with a cord wrapped around their neck and blood all over the walls with finger marks and all that. Looked like there'd been a violent struggle. We set that up as a murder investigation. It was running for 12 hours until we could get the forensic pathologist to examine the situation. This person had a ruptured aorta.
Oh, really?
And was making a phone call. The cord around his neck was a cord to the telephone, and was writhing round in agony with a ruptured aorta, coughing up blood, and the blood was hitting the wall. So, yeah, that's from that taught me, and that was very early in my career, the importance of getting the opinion of a forensic pathologist, because we'd still be looking for the murderer on that case.
Yeah, yeah.
What led you to this field?
Basically, laziness.
I like your honest answers.
I was going back to Canada. I trained in Tasmania, and I've been going to Canada. I'd done family practice training there, but I was going back to do emergency medicine. Right. And I was in Belize and having a great time snorkeling, and spent so much time snorkeling. By the time I got back to Canada, all the emergency jobs were taken. So all I had left was pathology.
And you didn't get a career as a snorkelist?
No. Okay. So then I went from general pathology to pediatric pathology to forensic pathology, and found it. I'm so pleased. It's fascinating. I mean, it covers so many areas of medicine and life and law. There's nothing quite like it.
Well, I see that you're passionate about it, and you've been working in it for a very, very long time. From it, the impact it has on you. You're looking at death, causes of death. What's the toll it's taken on you?
Well, I'm only 28.
I was going to say you're doing well for 30.
Yeah, that's right.
Okay.
It's an interesting question, and it's one that I've considered, as you know, and I've called it the right to mourn, and to say that nobody talks about post-traumatic stress with forensic pathologists, and yet every month of every year we go out to scenes, we see dismembered bodies, we see incinerated bodies, we see children that have been starved to death, we see vehicle accidents, dreadful scenes, and we have to not only immerse ourselves in it, we have to then describe it in great detail, understand it, then we have to present it sometimes to a jury and be attacked, have our credibility attacked while we're doing it. So we are so close to this. I think one of the things that saves us is the science of it. Yep. We're focusing on the science. We're not focusing on the horror of the situation. But I'm nearing the end of my career now. In fact, I'm nearly dead, probably.
Well, actually, if you died on the podcast,
that would be a spectacular finish.
It would be spectacular.
Yeah.
We could do something with it.
I'll see what I can do.
You wouldn't be forgotten.
Yes. Would that go in sort of television bloopers or?
Look, we'll find the place for it. This social media.
Okay,
I'm starting to come to terms with it. We'll find the place for
good,
you.
Good. I feel.
You'll go viral.
I feel confident. Yeah.
Okay.
But as I get to the end of my career, I've been thinking more and more about the toll and what I've seen.
Yeah.
And it doesn't get easier. My area is children, pediatric forensics, and when I first started, I knew I was going to find causes of these deaths, and gung-ho, and then as I got further and further into my career, I realised that no, I'm not going to find answers all the time, and I'm going to have to sit down with families and say, I have no idea.
Yeah.
All I can say to them is, it was nothing that you did. And also, a lot of the times, they just want to meet the person that looked after their baby.
Yeah.
Between the time when they saw the baby last and when they saw the baby at the funeral home, and to know that it wasn't just a case. And of course, I always refer to the babies by their name and just say this was not just a case for me or for the mortuary staff. A baby who has died or a little child has died is a tragedy, and there's no getting around it. And
that can, because they're very sensitive at that stage, and you say the wrong word or forget the child's name or
call the child it. I've seen people do that. You know? I mean, just terrible things. Yeah.
And they're real triggering for a person grieving. So I think I can see what you're saying, and it would have a great benefit to the people knowing that the person handling their child or that loved one is someone that's compassionate.
Well, I remember the first paediatric autopsy I did, a little French-Canadian girl called Genevieve. And that was back in 1984, I think. And I often wonder whether, because I use her case for teaching, I've often thought, should I get in contact with the parents and let them know that somebody remembers Genevieve?
Yeah.
But I don't know. I mean, it's so long ago, and maybe it's better just to let it go.
The perception of what is involved in a post-mortem you've done over 6,000 post-mortems. Can you just describe to our listeners what is involved in a post-mortem?
Yeah, it's a scientific medical examination of the body. So if it's a suspicious death, it'll involve the clothing and the surroundings. But if it's just a natural death, somebody's just sort of fallen over in the street, we bring them in, we video the bodies with the clothing and possession so that there's a record of that. We take the body into the mortuary, and then we do a really detailed external examination. So essentially, we're looking for any signs of injury, because that's what we want to exclude. Something that's unexpected that shouldn't be there. And we're looking for signs of disease as well. Sometimes you can identify disease from external examinations. And then we do a 3-cavity dissection. And this is the traditional autopsy. We've moved away from that now with radiological investigations. Yeah. But in the traditional form, you would open the head and examine the brain. You'd open the chest and examine the lungs and heart and the abdomen, liver, intestines. All the organs are taken out and weighed. They're carefully dissected, looking for tumours, looking for inflammation, looking for some sort of disease. We've moved on now. We have CT examinations. So all of our cases, most forensic mortuaries around the world get a CT, which is just a very sophisticated X-ray that gives us very good imaging. It's the same as the clinical CTs in hospitals. So we can see if there's a ruptured aorta. We can see if there's a blood around the heart. We can see if there's a florid pneumonia. We can see if there's a brain hemorrhage. So in those cases, we will then say, okay, we've got a cause of death. We'll do an external to make sure we don't see anything untoward, and then the families don't have to go through the whole process of having the autopsy done. We have the information we need. So it's I think, in a way, kinder to families. Some families want autopsies. Yeah. Some families don't. And if they don't, this is a way of sort of getting their loved ones back to them as soon as possible.
Yeah. Do you find now that it's progressed into getting CT scans and the science has improved along those lines, the findings that you had prior to CT scans were correct? Because quite often I'd be standing there at the post-mortem and we'd be looking at say it was a bullet wound, what was the direction of the bullet, stab wound, that type of thing. It looks like it's come from the left. Did that change the thinking on determining what the nature of the injuries were?
Yeah, CT's been excellent. It's interesting, as you know, with stab wounds, the knife will be taken out and then you'll do a careful layer dissection and you can say this is the way it was going. A friend of mine in Sweden a number of years ago did a CT on a stab wound with the knife in place.
Right.
And what the knife had done is it'd come in from the left side and pushed all of the organs to the right. But when you took the knife out, everything came back to the midline. So the careful dissection would say the knife was coming from the front. The CT told us a different story.
Okay.
And sometimes CTs will tell you something that's not at all obvious. I had a poor detective. He'd had a body, and this fellow had cut his wrists and arms and bled to death in the bath.
Yeah.
And so I was looking at the CT, and lo and behold, there was a collapsed lung, and there was a stab wound in the chest, which this bloke had missed.
Right.
And so I presented it to Major Crime, and I said, fancy missing that. I said, and look at the body. I missed it too.
Yeah.
Because what had happened is that the wound had closed over.
Okay.
So you couldn't, looking at the body externally, very hard to see. CT, 2 seconds.
Wow. Okay. Well, there's a science. Were you a believer in having the investigator at the post-mortem?
Absolutely, yes. Yeah, all the time. I mean, it's with OC health and safety rules now, sometimes the police have to stand on the other side of the observation screen.
Yeah.
I prefer to have the police in there so that we're talking about the case, working our way through it. When I find something, if I show you through a glass window, it's not the same as pointing it out to you directly.
No, I always found it beneficial to be at the post-mortem if I was on a particular investigation. Occupational health and safety, I tell this story and it probably dates me, but the first post-mortem I went to, and I'm not going to name the hospital and I'm sure the pathologist is long gone, was standing there smoking.
Yes.
No gloves on, and I walk in as this young cop. He shook my hand, and then I looked where his hands had been with no gloves and standing over the body smoking. Yeah. We've come a long way.
Well, I wear a full protective suit, so I've got a respirator. I have gloves, sleeves, food, smoking, nothing like that in the mortuary. No, it's a much more. It's a process that could be videoed and used to show people that it's done scientifically now and with respect. Yeah. With respect.
Well, that's the important thing, and I think that's the fear that the victims or the deceased families have is, what's going to happen? Who's caring for our loved one? Yeah. Regardless of the fact that they're now deceased. I want to talk, and this is I think it's played prominently in your career, not the only case, obviously. That's the bodies in the barrel case. We talk about the Snowtown murders. 11 people, I believe, were murdered, where the bodies were disposed. I think there was 8 bodies disposed in a disused bank in a small country town, in I'd call them 44-gallon drum type barrels. You had just started as a forensic pathologist.
Yep.
Down in South Australia.
That was my first week on call, actually.
I don't know what it is about South Australia, but whenever South Australia police phone me, it was never good news. There's something about South Australia, but
it's a special place.
Your second week, and you get a call. Do you want to talk us through the process of that case? It was a horrific case, and what you uncovered and the role that you played in that case.
Well, when I started, my colleagues in the eastern states were talking about Adelaide as being the city of churches and serial killers, and there's a certain truth to that. There's Snowtown. I was called by head of major crime one night. I think it was a Thursday night, and I was so green I didn't realise that when the head of major crime calls you, it's pretty serious. Yeah. He said he was in a little place called Snowtown, and he described the barrels, and they said, "Do you want to come up?" And I said, "No, the evidence is in there. Why don't you just bring them down to Adelaide?" So I didn't go to the crime scene because for me the crime scene was actually within the barrels. Yeah. So they were brought down, and the next day we had to work out the mechanics of how to handle this because they're very heavy. We'd been told they were full of acids, so it could be toxic, so we had to test the fluid. Then we had to work out how to empty the barrels and not lose evidence. Because it could be bullets or anything in there. So there were 8 bodies partially dismembered in the barrels.
What did you know at that stage?
Well, I tried to convince Paul Schramm that it was probably hydroponic. And he said, what should he do? And I said, well, take the lid off, and if you find remains, give me a call. And 10 minutes later, he said, yes, there are feet poking out.
Right.
So I said, oh dear, how many barrels? He said, 8 barrels. And I said, well, let's bring them down. But there were 2 bodies buried at Waterloo Corner. Clinton Tresice had been murdered. He was the first one buried up at Lower Light, and there was a case that was a hanging as well that was originally thought to be a suicide, but they'd actually forced this bloke to hang himself. So there were a number of them. But the mechanics of taking the bodies out was extraordinary.
And I hadn't even thought about the logistics, but yeah, moving the barrels and all sorts of potential issues. You don't know what's in them, so you work out the mechanics to get the barrels to your laboratory or the warehouse.
Mortuary, yeah.
And then how did you? What was the process?
Well, we took the lid off, had a look inside, got some idea what was going on, and they were in various states of decomposition. Some were actually quite well preserved. Then we put the lid back on, turned them on the side on a bench, and used sieves. The sieves for archaeological, and just sieved all the fluid as it came out. Right. So that we found thumb locks and gags and all sorts of things. So we didn't want that material to be lost because it was very important. So then, when all the fluid was out, we brought the bodies out and we just gave them letters A to F, and then put them on tarps and then just matched up. We did DNA testing, which didn't work. Yeah, which is interesting.
Why is that?
Well, that's what people said. You can do DNA testing on dinosaurs. I mean, why not this? Because of the nature of how the bodies were stored, they were in an oxygen-deprived environment, which was originally acidic, and DNA just doesn't survive that. We got a foot in a gumboot that came up in a fishing net in the bight, and we could do DNA on that, and it was from a fisherman who went overboard 10 years before. But the condition was obviously much better for preserving DNA than in these barrels.
Had the bodies had the flesh decomposed?
Yes, no, some hadn't, some had. Some were very well preserved, and we could see tattoos that you could use to identify. We could do dental records, and also the police had a fair idea who they were, which is obviously important, because if you have no idea who somebody is, how can you actually then do dental records? How can you?
Where do you start?
Yeah, that's right.
So what the role, and you've called out identification would play a part, but also the cause and manner of death?
Yes, indeed.
And what did you find?
It was difficult because of the poor preservation. The bodies had broken down. We were looking for natural diseases, but sometimes the organs were missing because they'd decomposed. Yep. We found gags and things put in their mouths. Suffocation was likely. As I said, they had handcuffs and thumb locks. So we didn't find any evidence of torture, probably because of the state of preservation. There'd been stories about they'd been inserting sparklets into their penises, and we could find no evidence of that, which doesn't mean that it didn't happen. And the cannibalism. The last victim, apparently, I've forgotten which perpetrator, might have been Bunting, took a slab of thigh and cooked it up for his mates. Where
did that information come from?
Jimmy Vlasakis was one of the perpetrators. So there's Bunting, Wagner, and Vlasakis, and he gave the police a lot of evidence, and he gave that story. Yeah.
How did that impact on you?
Again, you hide behind the science. People generally are just terrible at dealing with death now, but because we do it all the time, and because my aim was to see if I could find physical evidence of this to corroborate or disprove the story, then I'm focusing on that. So you sort of remove yourself. It's like surgeons in the operating room are sometimes leaning on a chest and then takes a breath. They realise that it's actually a patient, not just an appendix. You focus.
I understand, and one of the interviews that you did, you talked about it didn't impact because you had a job to do, that you were there, you were looking at this person as, okay, this is my role, this is a job.
Yeah, I think that's true. I mean, with Thailand, with the tsunami, when I was doing body identifications, I was offered a chance to go back a second time. I couldn't do it. There were so many dead children, and these piles of bodies, truckloads of bodies. That was, and you're just seeing the whole scene. You know, as you say, you're not focusing in on a knife wound and the horror of it all.
How long were you involved in the Snowtown investigation? Did you give evidence at court?
Yes, I did. Snowtown went on for years, actually. But initially we were asked about the state of the bodies and, had they putrefied, what sort of does this do to the evidence? And then the case that I went to court with, I assisted getting all the bodies out of the barrels, but then I was overseas for a couple of weeks. So the one that I was involved in was a skeletonized body found at Waterloo Corner. There were 2 bodies found there.
Yeah.
And again, could I exclude the fact that she had died of a heart attack and they'd just hidden the body? No, I couldn't.
Yeah.
Because I don't have the heart. If you don't have the organs, and I've done a study on concealment of homicides, and quite a significant percentage, as you know, are concealed, hoping they won't be found, or if they are found, they'll be so decomposed that a lot of the evidence will have gone.
Yeah, I find that, and I don't want to say too much. You don't want to give people ideas, but the amount of bodies that go into the water that surface, that come to the surface, and it gives us something to start the investigation with time and time again.
I think we can talk about it because I think that the people who do this sort of thing are so into the internet. I did a study a few years ago. They do surgical studies on pigs, and I got the carcasses, and I took a broken wine glass. I took a Qantas plastic knife that I'd bitten, and I took a stapler pen, and I could stab straight into the carotids. So what I was saying with that is that all the security measures at airports, if you really want to do it, you can do it. Yeah. And I wasn't informing terrorists; they know that.
Yeah, obviously. Why do we use pigs?
They're quite like us. I mean, the most similar, of course, would be primates, but that's no-go territory.
I'm not going there if
no,
you want to.
not at all. And so that is not done anymore. There have been some horrific experiments in the past. But with pigs, they can be anaesthetised. Their tissues are pretty similar to humans. We did a pig study with the series I did with Lawless, looking at the Kenneth brothers up in Queensland.
Yeah.
The classic story, the 2 bushrangers had killed a station owner and a cop, and then the what they thought dismembered remains were found in saddlebags, and they'd been put on a fire. And so the prosecution turned it around from being shot to actually these horrific creatures dismembered these poor men and then burnt them. So we got a whole pig carcass and a dismembered pig carcass put on the fire. The dismembered pig carcass disappeared. The whole carcass turned into what we had seen with the Kenneth. So we could show using the bodies there that their story was actually correct. They hadn't dismembered them.
Okay.
And that's historical forensics. That's not important nowadays, but it's interesting.
No, it is. Your court experience, how often would you find yourself in court?
It's interesting. I've never kept a record. I mean, sometimes, you know what it's like. You get 3 in a week. Other times you get nothing for months. So
you never want to see the inside of a court again.
Yeah, that's right. Other times, it can be a breeze. I mean, the last one I went to, I think it was a shooting, and both prosecution and defence agreed that, yes, it was a shooting. And they said, well, what did you find? I said, a gunshot wound. What did they die of? Gunshot wound. Thank you very much.
Yeah.
That I like that when and it happens more with experienced lawyers when they're not trying to make points or pursue some odd story. They're just taking what's obvious and then moving on.
We talked before we started recording about I've been involved in trials where there's a lot of medical evidence and how confusing it is for myself that I have an understanding of what's occurred, and you got the jury there, and people like yourself, eminently qualified people, are coming in and giving a very scientific explanation. Do you get a sense how difficult it would be for jurors on some cases, not citing any particular case, but some case to absorb all the information that's put forward to them?
Absolutely, and it's interesting. Sometimes I'm giving the most interesting information in my career, and the jury's asleep and the judge has gone to sleep.
Don't they realise how long I studied?
Other times I'm almost asleep myself and they're writing it all down. So it's fascinating, and I think it's particularly difficult with experts. I mean, you're an expert if you say you are sometimes. You don't have to have a background in it, and so you can get somebody being diametrically opposed to you, and they look like, an old guy that's been on the traps for 100 years, who do you believe? Also, now part of the problem is in publishing. There are these journals called predatory journals.
Right.
And they look absolutely kosher, but you pay to get your stuff published.
Okay, so the credibility.
I can give a journal, $2,000 US, and I can get a paper published on my theory, and that can be produced in court, and it looks
And then you
great.
present it as being published, your findings have been published.
I had a colleague in Malaysia that happened to. In the middle of the trial, I said, what about this? It goes completely against what you said.
Yeah.
So the way I handle that is... Your Honour, I haven't had a chance to read this. Could I have a 10-minute recess? And then I go out and I frantically Google, is this a predatory journal?
Right.
And if it comes up as one, then I go in and say, well, it's not worth the paper it's printed on.
Okay. Interesting. But,
Thank God for Google.
I don't know how we survived up until then. You talk about strange deaths and or different things that you've come across with the examinations that you've done. Animals killing people.
Mm-hmm.
I heard you talk on a podcast, Guardians of the Death, and talking about animals that kill. What's your experience with animals? Because some of the stuff you were saying was quite bizarre that I never expected.
Yeah, I've been collecting animal deaths. I mean, deaths from dogs, snakes, sharks, roosters, mackerel. There was a bloke fishing in the Darwin Harbour, and sharks were nearby, so this 25-kilogram mackerel jumped out of the water and sideswiped him. Yeah.
Wrong place, wrong time.
Absolutely. You can be unlucky. And the rooster death.
Please tell me about the rooster death.
It's just a little old lady out the back collecting eggs, and roosters, I understand, are nasty creatures. And it went for her, and she had varicose veins and pecked her leg. And I've had a number of deaths of people with varicose veins who have just had minor trauma. There was one, it was a cat scratch. And people don't realise, and this is the reason that I actually publicise this stuff. It's not because it's bizarre and weird. It's to let people know that if you've got varicose veins and you get a small hole, lie down and put your finger over it and elevate it.
Right.
And you'll survive. What they tend to do is wander around panicking, and they bleed to death. Completely unnecessary deaths.
Okay.
But yeah, never trust a rooster.
Okay, we'll take some advice there. Part of the stuff that you do too, and I found that interesting because people often look at forensic pathologists where you're only looking at death. But part of your attraction to the work that you do is that you can also prevent death.
Mm-hmm.
Now, you've given us all a warning about watching out for roosters if you've got varicose veins. We'll take that on board. What are some of the things that throughout your career that you've looked at? And I know that you had a high level of expertise in Sid's death.
Mm-hmm.
And how has that, what you've learnt, helped prevent those deaths down the track?
Well, it's interesting. My clinical colleagues call me Dr. Death because they don't understand forensic pathology. So they don't understand all that much, really. But I've got an area...
Okay, we'll...
delete
that. No, we won't delete that. Well, you can stand by your comments. Yep.
It's an area called preventive pathology.
Yeah.
And so it's taking cases from the mortuary and examining them and seeing what went wrong and what you can do to prevent it. And this is one of the joys I find of paediatric forensic pathology. People say, how can you do it? I say, well, if I can actually find something that caused this death and then let people know about it, like unsafe cots. Unsafe cots years ago, they were all over the place and kids were hanging themselves and getting stuck in them and wedging. So I work with KidSafe, and we lobbied the federal government, and now there's a standard. All cots, even second-hand ones, have to follow the Australian standard. So you cannot sell an unsafe cot. And that's saved lives. I don't see... can't remember the last unsafe cot I've seen. So that's really heartening. The SIDS story is interesting. I mean, I've been involved with SIDS groups for decades, and we did a collaborative study with Harvard, and we showed that the SIDS babies have a deficiency in a chemical in the back of the brain that controls their head and neck movement, substance P. So we've always said, why are they dying face down? Why don't they just lift their heads? They don't lift their heads because they can't. So we're looking at genetic markers of that. So maybe we can have a diagnostic marker to show kids at increased risk. So that sort of thing, I think, makes this job really rewarding.
Yeah. Well, you talk about the cots, and wasn't the old school thinking about laying children on their, I'm talking young infants, laying them on their stomach, and that changed with the...
Medicine's an interesting area, and if you look at the history of babies' sleeping patterns, babies used to be put to sleep on their backs, and then people said, no, they'll vomit and they'll aspirate, let's put them face down.
Yep.
And so there was a really strong push to have babies sleeping face down. There was a pediatrician, Abrams, in New York, who said, don't do this, they'll suffocate. And there was a study that showed that by putting babies face down, probably 60,000 babies died. You don't hear that very often, that medicine was responsible for that, because it was a health initiative that didn't have evidence. And they said, you put them on their back, they're going to vomit and inhale. They don't.
Yeah.
So it was just well-intentioned but wrong.
No, I understand now what you're saying about the work, forensic pathologists. It's not all about, okay, the death's happened, there's nothing we can do, move on to the next death. There is things that you can pick up in the science and the medical science that can assist.
And that's why talking to you like this I think is important, because it tells people what forensics is about. So it means that when I retire, I'm not going to get leather-bound set of my autopsy reports, I've put another notch on the wall. I've actually done something to have an impact in medicine. It may be because I am a qualified general practitioner. I qualified in general practice in Canada before I started forensics, and so that maybe has given me an idea of what the community deserves.
Yeah, so you're looking at prevention. A couple of other little side, I won't say side hustles, that's not the right word, but...
Careful.
Careful, okay. You had an interest in going back and look at historical cases involving bushrangers, and I thought that was quite interesting. Do you want to talk us through that and what inspired you to have a look?
Well, the two areas that I find interesting... bushrangers and Rasputin. I don't know whether you've seen my paper,
Okay,
the death of Rasputin.
I have. You can take us through Rasputin.
You'll like
as well.
that one, yeah. No, the bushrangers, I got involved with a Foxtel series, Lawless, and we looked at Ned Kelly, Captain Moonlight, Ben Hall, and the Kenneth brothers.
Yep.
And basically trying to see what evidence there was for the historical story. If you look at Ben Hall, the popular theory is that basically the police snuck up on him and shot him in his swag. The police version, some things don't change, is a bit.
You be careful.
Is a bit different.
Yep.
They said they were waiting for him. They called him to stop. He didn't, and then Constable Hipkiss shot him through and through with a .56. Went through his gun belt. So we had the gun belt at the Powerhouse Museum. Nobody had ever looked at it properly. I put it together, and it was extraordinary. The bullet hole, it was a bullet hole, and it was shelving, and the only place you could have shot him to do that would have been standing behind him to the left where Hipkiss was. Then we did scanning electron microscopy, which looks at sort of particles, and we found accelerant and part of the bullet that killed Ben Hall.
Okay.
Which got lost in the cutting room floor, because I thought it was the most fascinating part of the story.
And your interpretation from that?
That the police story was absolutely correct.
Okay,
yeah,
so supporting the police. Another one that you looked at, Ned Kelly, that's been put up there as this folk hero. You've got differing views?
I'm amazed. I mean, we had a stamp issued on the 100th anniversary of his death.
Yeah.
He was at the Sydney Olympics, and yet he was a bloke who very proudly stole cattle and horses from sharecroppers. He wasn't stealing always from squatters. So people whose livelihood depended on this, he was taking.
So it wasn't a Robin Hood situation.
As I say, Robin Hood did not steal from the poor and keep it for himself. And yes, you only have to look at the Jerilderie letter where he says he wants the blood of the brains and the police to rain down, where he wants to tie people who oppose him over ant heaps and pour their fat boiling down their throats. If the Glenrowan train crash had occurred, it would have been the biggest killing of police to date in Australian history.
Set up to ambush them.
28 police by derailing the train. I don't think killing serving police officers is a good thing. And I don't think the person who has done it should be treated as a hero. People will say to me at meetings and stuff, well, the Americans do it. Billy the Kid. Didn't see Billy the Kid at the LA Olympics.
Yeah. Well, true. It's funny.
And we named so many things after Ned Kelly.
Yeah.
He was a sociopath and a thug.
Yeah. Well, part of our history, isn't it? And Oh, interesting. What other things about Ned Kelly did you learn looking into the history?
Well, it was interesting. When we were filming Lawless up at Stringybark Creek. Stringybark, have you been to Stringybark?
No.
It's actually quite an eerie place.
Yeah. Because of the history of it?
Yeah, and it's just got a presence.
Yeah.
But what they wanted to do is they wanted to have relatives of people on both sides. So Leo Kennedy, who was the great-grandson of Sergeant Kennedy, who was executed by Ned Kelly.
Yep.
He actually initiated the whole project by saying how terrible it is to go to his relatives' graves to find Kelly memorabilia, where giving memorial to the killers, but not to the serving police officers.
Yeah.
But one of Kelly's relatives was there, and I was asked what I thought of the killing of Sergeant Kennedy, and I said, well, when you shoot an unarmed man point blank in the chest with a shotgun, it's an execution. And this fellow said, I don't know about that, none of us were there. And I said, well, Sergeant Kennedy was there, and Kelly came out with a shotgun. So he could have put him on a horse and sent him back.
Because the narrative that's been fed is that he was dying and he put him out of his misery, so it was a noble action. But you're suggesting otherwise.
Well, I wouldn't trust things that Ned said. No,
you're so judgmental, Roger.
I am. This is what happens.
Rob a couple of banks and shoot a couple of people. And
that's.
What about his armour? What's your take on that? From would that protect him from a forensic pathologist point of view?
Yeah, well, it's interesting because if he'd actually successfully killed all those police with the derailment, it would have been the biggest killing of police officers to date in Australia. But I thought it was just a somewhat Irish approach to armour, that he'd only had the upper part of his body protected. But it was actually well thought out. That's probably a racist slur, actually.
Yeah,
I have to delete that. My great-grandmother was Irish, so I can say that.
Yeah. You can balance that out then.
But the plan was that the carriage would go over the embankment, and he would be protected by the embankment, so his legs wouldn't have to be covered. And, of course, it was made out of ploughshares, so it was very heavy. So if you could reduce as much weight as you could. Yeah. The other thing, too, is, such is life. He didn't say that.
Really?
Yeah. No, it's just myth. Yes.
So, with all those people that have such a life, and it was you, wasn't it, that identified if you've got Ned Kelly tattoos?
Oh, yes.
Talk us through that. That's another obscure fact that came from I think Roger's
it's so obscure. But no, I just noticed that a lot of the people coming into the mortuary with Ned Kelly tattoos had died violent deaths. So I did a retrospective study, and then I did a 10-year prospective study, and sure enough, something like 80% of them have died of accidents or suicides or homicides or all sorts of strange things. That's in a forensic context. That doesn't mean if you're in the community and you've got a Ned Kelly tattoo, you're marked. But it's I think a mark for sometimes drug-associated lifestyles or risk-taking.
Risk-taking. It's interesting, brother. I remember when I looked at or heard you say that, I thought,
I get your Kelly tattoo taken off.
No, I'm taking it off straight away.
Yeah, I think so.
I had an informant that was pretty hard to hide, and he's passed away now, so I can talk about him. But he had a bald head and a tattoo of Ned Kelly on the back of his head, with the helmet and the two guns. He was hard to hide, needless to say.
Now, Rasputin.
Oh yes, please do.
I've always been fascinated by Rasputin, and the story is that he was invited round to Prince Yusupov's house. He was given enough cyanide to kill a horse. They bludgeoned him, and then they shot him, and then they threw him into the Neva River, and the autopsy showed that he actually drowned.
Okay.
So I thought, well, this sounds not plausible. So there's one crime scene shot, and there's a contact gunshot wound in his head. You don't get that underwater. Okay. You don't get that running across the courtyard yelling out, I'm going to tell the Tsarina. You get that when you walk into the place. Oh, and the toxicology was negative for the cyanide as well. You get that walking into the place. They want to get rid of him. What do? They put a gun to his head and shoot him. I mean, they want to get it over with quickly. So just that one photograph on the historical record could show that all of the mythology around Rasputin's death was wrong.
Okay.
Isn't it interesting? Just
It is.
applying modern techniques to that. Yeah.
Well, it is interesting. And look, I catch killers. Here we are on the podcast, and we're solving something.
Yes,
and,
we are.
unraveling. There was another, and I think it was a recent article that you did about. Again, it's just the bizarre world that you look at, but your observations of the world that mummified males dying in their house in South Australia. What? Tell us about that.
I was sitting one Sunday night and there was an SBS program on this thing called Kotokushi in Japan. And it's elderly folk without family or social contacts being found dead after months or years in their homes. And so I thought, that's interesting. I wonder whether that happens here. So I did a study looking at elderly 20 years ago, elderly now, and the percentage of cases that had decomposition, and it increased markedly. The major group is 60 to 69-year-old, this is in South Australia, 60 to 69-year-old males. And it makes sense because they're the ones whose relationships have fallen apart.
Yep.
Their kids have moved out. Their friends have all gone. They're getting into alcohol abuse and they're lonely. So when they die, nobody knows.
And you're getting, or they're being referred to examinations. People are being called and or coming across an abandoned place and find these bodies.
Yeah. Well, you see it in the news all the time, don't you?
Yeah.
You know, somebody was found, they hadn't been seen for 3 years and nobody cared.
Yeah.
The way around this is to have communities. And where I live in North Adelaide, there's a coffee shop that we all go to. And about 2 years ago, one of the old fellows used to come every morning, didn't turn up. So people went around.
Yeah.
He'd had a stroke and he was in his bed. Now, if he hadn't had that contact, he'd be yet another statistic.
Yeah.
So we've just got to get back to understanding the importance of community.
That very much the way life can live these days. You can not have contact, and those little things like you're not going down to the local newsagent to buy the paper in the morning.
Yeah.
That could be a simple thing, but we've lost all that, and we can sit on our phones or on our computers and not have that human contact. But it's interesting that you identified that. What's the most bizarre case you've come across?
There was a shearer talking about animal deaths who basically got his throat cut because of the electric shears, and the sheep kicked the shears. You know, something you wouldn't expect.
Right.
I remember one fellow had, I think, 30 cats in his house. And of course, animals, when you're dead, get hungry and they feed on you. So these cats had just stripped his body. Of course, I don't know how he died because there are no organs left.
Yeah.
If you have a suspected homicide by shooting, and say dogs have been at the body, you need to get the youngest probationary constable to go around and pick up all the dog scats.
In the dog droppings.
To x-ray them, look for bullets. And you need to look at the dogs to see if there's bullets inside them.
Okay.
So, I suppose the worst would have been Jasmine Core.
Yeah.
The most bizarre probably would have been Snowtown.
Okay. Well, with the Snowtown, I know that you've made a comment that that stuck with you for a bit. You were getting the dreams.
Only for about a week, yeah.
Okay.
I dreamt I was coming back alive, yeah.
Talk us through that, because not many people talk about that.
No, it's just it's only happened to me twice. Once was with Snowtown, and I just was having these nightmares that the bodies were all coming back alive. The tsunami, I had nightmares after that. Yeah. Only for a short time. And Jasmine, I didn't have nightmares. I just couldn't get her death out of my head. It really weighed heavily on me because it was so horrific.
Another sad case, that the murder of Samantha O'Reilly.
15-year-old.
What was the circumstances surrounding that case? And this sort of demonstrates what a forensic pathologist can bring to an investigation.
Yes. I mean, I can talk about this, as you know, because it's been through the courts and everybody knows what happened, and the perpetrator's been convicted. Her body was found semi-clad beside a road north of Adelaide, Humbug Scrub it was, and it was a strange scene. Her underwear had been obviously taken off and put on again, and so we don't undress bodies at the scene because you'll lose things. So we took her into the mortuary, and she'd been strangled. And underneath her underpants, I found a tuft of green carpet and all these brown flakes. It turned out to be paint flakes. I also took a lot of DNA swabs. I will swab anything, because if I get a negative result, who cares? If I get a positive result, great. And I did get a positive result for DNA from the outside of her genitalia. And so the police announced they were going to test all the men in the district. The perpetrator, he tried to kill himself but failed and turned himself in. If we hadn't had the DNA, the carpet came from the back of his car and the paint flakes came from his back step. So it shows you that we've got modern scientific techniques, but we could have also had something to fall back on. And just shows you just a tiny tuft of carpet is one of the most important parts of the autopsy. You know, my mother could tell that she'd been strangled, but she mightn't understand the significance of the carpet.
Did you feel the pressure when you're doing autopsies on cases like that, and a very sad case of 15-year-old girl? Did you feel the pressure that when you're looking at this, doing the autopsy, making sure that you're not missing anything?
Well, that's where I think the police help. Actually, you know, when they're in the autopsy room, because we're working through it together. So, and the police have never put pressure on me to speed a case through or to come up with a particular conclusion. They've always been incredibly reasonable, and I do appreciate that. But it was very sad, because at the end of the autopsy, it was about 3 a.m. The mortuary attendant said, "Have you noticed something about her?" I said, "Yeah, she doesn't have her ears pierced." She was quite a naive little girl, and she used to go up to the bride shop at the shopping centre and look at bridal gowns and imagine being married in Bali. Yeah,
that's just in your take on that situation that sort of brings it home what we're talking about, isn't it?
It does, and I feel sad 20 years later still.
Yeah. It's horrible.
And if you don't feel sad, then I don't think you should be doing the job, actually.
Look, you say that. I agree. I've been surprised when working homicides that some people just seem to have a disconnect, and I'm thinking, are you actually understanding what we're doing here, the importance of it, and the impact it should have on you? And I think a chip's missing if you don't pick up on...
I do too. And one other thing that we can do that's useful as forensic pathologists, you know, if you're in court and the family are there, and I remember going through a horrific assault, this young woman, and she was Irish, and her father he'd come out, and I went out to him afterwards and I said, "You realise, of course, that she had quite a significant head injury, so it's quite likely she was unconscious right at the beginning and felt nothing." Now, I don't know that, but it's possible. And at least that's something he can hold on to.
On to.
Rather than listening to all of my description of the horror of it.
I've found families want to be informed, and there's a time and place when they can be informed. If the investigation's ongoing, sometimes you've got to protect the integrity of it. But in my dealings, and I'm not saying that it's across the board, but in my dealings, family, at some point in time, I'll sit down and I'll tell you everything that I know, and they appreciate it. Because otherwise, as you said, it's just circling around in their head, wondering what took place. Get
the wrong end of the stick sometimes, and it's so easy just to correct it. And I've had a woman contact me 25 years after I autopsied her daughter.
Really?
Just to go over it again. Yeah, it was lovely actually, because she sent me a poem this little girl had written with a photograph of her afterwards.
Yeah.
So that's what makes it worthwhile.
It must mean a lot to you. Those little things like that make it. We might take a break here. When we get back, we've got so much to talk about. I want to talk about the tsunami and the process and what your involvement there in disaster victim identification. Also the Bali bombing. I think you're involved in that, and a couple of other cases that you've lent your expertise to getting to the bottom of it. Also want to talk about your thoughts on life and death, because I find it fascinating, someone like yourself that has seen so much death, what your take on the whole, what is our purpose here? So we might delve a little bit deep into that if you don't mind.
Sounds great.
Okay, great.